January 1945. The war in Europe was nearing its brutal end, yet winter refused to surrender its grip. Along a snow-covered road in western Germany, a convoy of American trucks crawled through the icy fog. Inside the back of one vehicle sat a dozen young women, former auxiliaries of the German Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. Their gray uniforms were creased, their boots caked with frozen mud, their faces pale but proud. They said little. The sound of engines and the occasional clang of metal chains filled the silence. When the convoy halted at a temporary U.S. detention camp, the guards offered food, canned meat, bread, and steaming coffee. None of the women moved. One whispered a quiet refusal. Another turned her face away. To them, accepting food from the enemy meant accepting defeat. The Americans exchanged puzzled looks. To them, these weren't monsters, just tired prisoners of a lost cause. But orders were orders. The women were to eat. Then one soldier broke the silence. Ignoring the tension around him, he walked forward with something simple in his hands, something that would speak louder than orders or threats. That quiet act would change the entire camp's atmosphere, and it all began in the final chaotic months of the Third Reich. By the beginning of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. Allied bombers darkened the skies above the Ruhr, Dresden, and Berlin. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army surged relentlessly westward, while in the west, American and British forces pressed through France, Belgium, and into the heart of Germany. Every village, every bridge, every railway line had become a battlefield. Inside Germany, the war machine was running on fumes. Manpower had been drained by years of total war, and the Nazi leadership turned increasingly to women to fill vital roles. They became clerks, radio operators, code specialists, and telephone assistants. Many were part of the Wehrmacht Helferinnen, the female auxiliaries of the armed forces. In Luftwaffe units, they relayed communications to flak batteries and aircraft crews. In army outposts, they transmitted orders from command to front lines. Propaganda had taught them loyalty, discipline, and above all, defiance. These women wore uniforms, saluted officers, and considered themselves part of Germany's defense. But when the Allied advance overran their stations, they found themselves prisoners. The first large-scale capture of German women in uniform. For the Allied soldiers, it was a strange sight. Many had fought through Normandy and the Ardennes, facing male soldiers hardened by years of war. Now they were escorting women, some barely 20 years old, in military attire. To the Germans, captivity was humiliation. They had been raised on the myth of victory or death, and surrender carried an unbearable weight of shame. The American forces, following strict codes, separated female POWs from male prisoners and organized transport to secured camps in France, Belgium, and the newly captured regions of Western Germany. These women were no longer operators or auxiliaries. They were simply enemy detainees, stripped of rank, purpose, and the structure that had defined their lives. Yet even in defeat, they held their composure. Witnesses described them as quiet, disciplined, and distant, their pride intact even when surrounded by the symbols of Allied victory. They refused small talk, ignored attempts at kindness, and carried themselves with the rigid bearing of soldiers who had been taught that their captors were enemies of their nation and their honor. But soon, their rigid silence would collide with something unexpected, a gesture not of domination, but of humanity. The American prisoner of war camps across Western Europe were, by the standards of wartime, remarkably organized. Built and maintained under the guidelines of the 1929 Geneva Convention, they aimed to ensure humane treatment of captured personnel, food, shelter, medical care, and correspondence with families through the Red Cross. By early 1945, thousands of German soldiers filled these camps. But as Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany, they began to encounter something new: German women in uniform. Few American officers had experience handling female POWs, and military protocol was hastily adjusted. Temporary compounds were fenced off, tents were erected, and female military police or nurses were sometimes assigned to supervise. To the Americans, it was a logistical challenge. To the Germans, it was a cultural shock. The women, raised on years of propaganda that painted Allied soldiers as brutal conquerors, now found themselves in their custody. Many expected mistreatment, even violence. Instead, they were offered food, blankets, and fair treatment, small gestures that clashed violently with everything they had been told. Yet propaganda had done its work. For these women, defeat was not merely military, it was spiritual. They had been taught that the fatherland was sacred, that German discipline and purity stood above all. To eat from the enemy's hand felt like betrayal. Pride turned to hunger strikes. Silence became their last form of resistance. The American guards couldn't understand it. Most were young men, far from home, tired of war. They saw frightened faces, not dangerous enemies. To them, food was simple, a sign of decency, a routine. But for the captured women, each meal was a battlefield between belief and survival. Reports from U.S. Army archives mention similar cases, groups of German women refusing rations for days, some collapsing from exhaustion. Medical officers intervened, not out of hostility, but concern. The women's loyalty to an ideology that had already crumbled baffled them. They were fighting a war that, for everyone else, was already over. And yet, in one camp, what began as a standoff of silence would transform into a moment that none of those present would forget. A single U.S. soldier, neither officer nor leader, would bridge that invisible divide, not with authority, but with empathy. The gesture he made was small, almost unnoticeable, but its echo would carry far beyond the barbed wire of that camp, and into the story of how humanity sometimes survived even in the heart of war. To the American soldiers guarding the camp, the refusal of the German women to eat seemed absurd. They were offered warm soup, bread, and rations that the soldiers themselves ate daily. Yet day after day, the food remained untouched. The women sat silently in the corner of the mess tent or inside their barracks, hands folded, eyes averted. It wasn't defiance in the loud, rebellious sense. It was something deeper, quieter, and far more powerful. Hunger had become their final weapon. When their radios, uniforms, and insignias were taken, all that remained was pride. To refuse sustenance was to assert control, a symbolic protest in a world where they no longer commanded anything. For some, it was loyalty to a fallen nation. For others, it was fear. Fear of humiliation, of proving the propaganda wrong. Refusing food gave them the illusion of dignity in captivity. Psychologists who later studied such behavior among POWs described it as a form of identity preservation. These women had been molded by years of indoctrination, taught that Germany's enemies were savages, that surrender was dishonor, that death was preferable to subjugation. Nazi propaganda had elevated the idea of duty to something sacred, and women were expected to embody the nation's moral strength. Through endless speeches, school programs, and radio broadcasts, they were told that the Allied invaders would bring ruin and degradation. By the time the war turned against Germany, this fear had hardened into faith, a blind conviction that anything offered by the enemy was poisoned with deceit. Many of these young auxiliaries had never left their towns before the war. They joined not as soldiers, but as patriots, believing they were protecting their homeland. Captivity shattered that illusion, and so hunger became a silent statement. We may be captured, but we are not broken. Inside that camp, the American guards saw women who seemed outwardly calm, but were fighting invisible wars inside their minds. Days passed, and physical weakness began to show. Still, they resisted. It was not food they rejected. It was the acceptance of defeat. And as their defiance grew quieter, something began to change among the men who watched them. A realization that what they were witnessing wasn't hatred, but the last echo of belief. To the Americans stationed at the camp, war had stripped away nearly all illusions of glory. They had seen the cost: the frozen fields of the Ardennes, the bodies in the ruins of Aachen, the endless convoys of the wounded. By 1945, most soldiers were young men hardened by exhaustion rather than hate. When they saw the captured German women refusing food, their first reaction wasn't anger, it was confusion. The U.S. Army ran its camps on order and discipline, but within those rules, humanity often surfaced in quiet, unexpected ways. Guards rotated shifts, sharing cigarettes, telling stories, and sometimes wondering aloud what the women must have believed to starve themselves voluntarily. Some joked, others grew frustrated, but a few simply felt pity. Among them was a private, one of thousands who'd been fighting across Europe since Normandy. He'd lost friends, seen towns destroyed. Yet in front of these prisoners, he saw something that didn't resemble the enemy he had imagined. They weren't armed, nor arrogant, just frightened, proud, and silent. He noticed one of them, a girl who couldn't have been more than 20, clutching a photo of her family. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The moment demanded no orders, no speeches. Quietly, the soldier took his own ration tin, heated it himself, and prepared something simple: a slice of bread toasted on the edge of a canteen flame, a small piece of chocolate he had saved from a Red Cross parcel. He approached slowly, placing it near her without a word, then stepped back. At first, no one moved. The camp was silent, eyes fixed on her trembling hands. Then almost hesitantly, she reached out. The act was small, almost invisible, yet it broke an invisible wall built by years of propaganda. For that soldier, it wasn't about mercy or victory. It was about recognition. He had seen suffering on both sides and understood that beneath the uniforms, everyone was bound by the same human needs: hunger, fear, hope. That single gesture spread quietly. Others began to follow, offering bread, cigarettes, even conversation. In a place defined by war's divisions, dignity had returned in the simplest form possible. And while no official report would ever mention it, those who witnessed it knew what it meant: that even in war, humanity can survive, not through grand speeches, but through one man's choice to treat his enemy as human. The tension had shifted, yet beyond that barbed wire, the wider war still raged. And soon, events far greater than that small camp would determine the fate of millions. By the third day of the hunger strike, the atmosphere inside the camp had turned heavy and brittle. The winter air bit through the canvas walls and frost clung to the wire fences. The German women sat huddled together, their faces pale, lips dry, eyes sunken with exhaustion. Guards watched from a distance, uneasy. They weren't dealing with aggression or escape attempts, only silence, a silence that unsettled everyone. Medical officers had warned that continued refusal to eat could lead to collapse. Orders were given to encourage compliance, but not by force. The Americans knew these women were not ordinary prisoners. They were symbols of a defeated ideology. To push too hard risked breaking something far deeper than obedience. Inside the mess tent, rations went cold. The smell of coffee and soup filled the air, a cruel reminder of what they refused. Some soldiers muttered in frustration, others avoided the scene altogether. But one man, the same private who had quietly watched them the night before, decided to act. He approached the field kitchen, where leftover rations lay stacked in tins. From his own pack, he pulled a single chocolate bar. Something precious, sent from home months earlier. It wasn't much, but to him, it carried a meaning beyond food. He melted part of it in a small tin cup, mixing it with hot water and powdered milk. The smell was faint but warm, a smell that spoke of comfort, not command. He walked toward the women slowly. They watched him with suspicion, their eyes tracing every movement. He said nothing. Instead, he set the small cup before the youngest of them, the same one who clutched the photograph. Then he stepped back, standing silently as steam rose between them. For a long moment, no one moved. The woman looked at the cup, then at the soldier. Around her the others waited, uncertain. The gesture defied every warning they'd been given. That Americans would mock them, punish them, treat them as lesser. But there was no mockery here, just a quiet act of offering. Her trembling hand reached forward. She lifted the cup to her lips. The chocolate was thin and lukewarm, but to her it tasted of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Safety. The guards nearby watched in stunned silence. No order had been given, no rule broken. Yet something irreversible had happened. A wall built by propaganda and fear had just cracked. At first, no one spoke. The sound of the tin cup clinking softly against the wooden table was the only movement in the tent. Then something subtle began to change. The other women, who had been sitting rigidly with folded arms, started to glance at one another, uncertain, cautious, but curious. The young German, who had tasted the chocolate, didn't hide her reaction. Her eyes softened, her shoulders eased. She set the cup down carefully, as though afraid to break the fragile peace that had just emerged. The soldier gave a slight nod and turned away, heading back toward his post without another word. That silence spoke louder than any command. Within the hour, 2 more women accepted food. Small portions, barely enough to fill their stomachs, but symbolically enormous. By nightfall, several had begun eating again. The American cooks noticed and prepared extra soup, pretending not to stare as the prisoners lined up quietly, hesitant but willing. Word spread quickly through the camp. No one wrote it in a report, but everyone knew. The act wasn't about defiance or charity anymore. It was about recognition. One simple human gesture had succeeded where authority could not. For the American guards, the moment lingered. Some spoke of it around the fires that night, wondering aloud how one act of kindness could undo weeks of hostility. Others brushed it off, calling it luck. But deep down, they knew what they had seen. The moment when war's hatred flickered and humanity briefly returned. For the German women, it was no less profound. Their indoctrination had told them that the enemy would gloat, degrade, and destroy. Yet here, in this camp, surrounded by barbed wire, an American soldier had shown something entirely different. Empathy without agenda. It challenged everything they had believed about their captors, and perhaps even about themselves. The next morning, when the soldier walked past their barracks, the women stood in silence once more. But this time, it wasn't defiance. One of them, the same young woman who had accepted the drink, gave a faint nod. No words were exchanged. None were needed. That small gesture rippled outward. Other camps reported similar changes, quieter tensions, fewer refusals, softer gazes. The war itself was still raging, but inside that camp, for a fleeting moment, the cruelty of ideology had given way to the decency of one man's choice. In a world collapsing under violence, that moment stood as proof that compassion could survive, even among enemies. But outside the wire, the war was entering its most destructive phase yet, and soon, the aftermath of Germany's fall would test how long that humanity could endure. In the weeks that followed, calm slowly returned to the camp. The hunger strike faded into memory, replaced by the quiet routines of captivity. Roll calls, inspections, mealtime cues. Yet something fundamental had changed. Guards and prisoners no longer looked at each other as faceless enemies. Respect, fragile but real, had begun to take root. The incident, though never officially recorded, reflected a broader shift in how the U.S. military handled female prisoners of war. As the Allies captured more territory, the number of German women taken into custody increased. By mid-1945, Thousands of female auxiliaries and nurses were held in camps across France, Belgium, and Western Germany. The U.S. Army, guided by the Geneva Convention and international oversight, maintained strict standards for treatment. The International Committee of the Red Cross conducted periodic inspections, confirming that female POWs were housed separately, provided medical care, and allowed correspondence with their families. Many reports noted the professionalism of American camp staff and the gradual psychological adaptation of the prisoners. Still, behind those formal records lay untold human stories of mistrust, slowly replaced by small gestures of understanding. The Red Cross observers occasionally remarked on instances of mutual respect developing between guards and prisoners, though they rarely elaborated. Food, once a symbol of defiance, became a bridge of reconciliation. After that first incident, U.S. officers quietly encouraged the use of familiar German-style meals: bread, potatoes, broth, hoping to ease tension. It worked. Reports noted a decline in food refusals and improved morale among female detainees. For many Americans, these women were reminders that the enemy was not a single, unified monster, but a mosaic of individuals, some complicit, some misled, many simply caught in the machinery of war. The small camp episode became an unspoken lesson that compassion, even toward one's enemy, could restore order faster than punishment ever could. Yet beyond the fences, the war was ending in ruins. Germany's cities lay shattered, millions were displaced, and soon the fate of these women, and of the soldier whose quiet act had changed everything, would take a new turn as repatriation began. By late summer 1945, the war in Europe was officially over. The surrender of Germany on May 8th marked the beginning of an immense logistical and moral challenge: the return of millions of prisoners of war to their homelands. For the captured German women, the process was slow, uncertain, and emotionally complex. Transport trains began departing from the American camps, carrying women who had once served as typists, radio operators, and nurses back into a nation they no longer recognized. The landscape they returned to was one of ash and silence. Cities flattened, families scattered, and the ideology they had served exposed as a lie. Many carried the memory of captivity with them, not as trauma, but as transformation. Some later wrote in memoirs or letters, recalling how kindness from an enemy soldier had challenged their beliefs. One woman would describe years later a single cup of chocolate that tasted more like mercy than victory. For her, that moment had redefined the meaning of humanity after years of indoctrination. The soldier who had offered that gesture remained anonymous. His name was never entered into any report, and his action went unmentioned in official archives. He returned home like thousands of others, to an America eager to forget the war's moral complexities. Perhaps he spoke of it once, or perhaps he never did. To him, it had been nothing more than a decent thing to do, but to those who witnessed it, that act became a quiet legend, passed in whispers among camp survivors and Red Cross volunteers. It represented the moment when compassion, stripped of uniform and flag, stood taller than hatred itself. In post-war Europe, many of the former female auxiliaries would rebuild their lives as civilians. Some married, others worked as translators or teachers during Reconstruction. For most, the war remained a distant shadow, but that brief moment of kindness stayed vivid, like a fragment of light remembered through darkness. It was proof that even as empires fell and nations burned, one person's simple act could bridge the deepest divide, not by changing history, but by reminding those lost within it that mercy was still possible. War has a way of stripping people down to their most primal selves: fear, hunger, survival. It divides the world into clear lines: friend and enemy, victory and defeat. Yet history reminds us that within those lines, The smallest acts of empathy can blur the boundaries entirely. The story of the German women and the American soldier was not about strategy or power. It was about the fragile persistence of humanity amid destruction. In a war defined by cruelty on an industrial scale, one man's quiet kindness became a rebellion of its own, a refusal to let hatred dictate every action. The paradox of war is that enemies are often mirror images, shaped by different flags but driven by the same needs: food, safety, dignity. The soldier who offered his ration and the woman who finally accepted it were not symbols of opposing nations that day. They were two human beings momentarily freed from the machinery of ideology. Empathy does not end wars, but it preserves something sacred within them. The proof that conscience can survive even when reason fails. That day, inside a camp surrounded by barbed wire and despair, compassion reminded both sides of what the war had almost erased. That mercy is not weakness, and that humanity, even when silent and unseen, is the most enduring victory of all.